Welcome, dear listeners, to a delightful, cozy mystery in the classic tradition of Agatha Christie. Settle in with a cup of tea as we journey to the charming village of St. Mary Mead in post-war England. Here, the unassuming Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye for human nature and gentle knitting needles, unravels a web of deception surrounding a beloved local antique dealer. This is Miss Marple and the antique dealer's fraud. Enjoy the tale. Chapter 1. The Discovery in the Shop. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where thatched cottages lined narrow lanes and the church spire rose gently against the sky, life in the late 1940s proceeded with the unhurried rhythm of Old England. The war had ended some years earlier. Ration books were still in use but growing thinner, and people once again found pleasure in small, everyday things. A walk along the hedgerows, a chat at the post office, or an hour spent browsing the curiosities at Hargrove's Antiques on the High Street. Mr. Reginald Hargrove, the proprietor, was a familiar and well-liked figure. A portly man in his middle 60s with a ruddy complexion, a booming voice, and a neatly trimmed gray mustache, he had run the shop for nearly 30 years. His windows displayed an enticing jumble of treasures: gleaming Georgian silver, delicate spode china, mahogany occasional tables, and glass cabinets filled with porcelain figurines, ivory miniatures, and faded samplers. Villagers trusted him implicitly. He knew the history, or at least a convincing story, for every piece he sold, and he was always ready to extend a little credit to an old customer in temporary difficulties. On a bright autumn morning, when the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and the leaves along the lane were turning gold, Miss Jane Marple decided to pay a visit to the shop. She was a slight, elderly lady with fluffy white hair, bright blue eyes that missed very little, and a manner so gentle that many underestimated the sharpness of her mind. Dressed in a neat tweed coat and a soft felt hat, she carried a capacious handbag and walked with the aid of a stick, though she moved more briskly than many half her age. Miss Marple had a small errand in mind. Her nephew Raymond, the novelist who lived in London, had written to say that his wife Joan's birthday was approaching. Joan admired Wedgwood, and Miss Marple thought a modest vase or bowl from Hargrove's might make a suitable gift. She had noticed a pretty pale blue jasperware piece in the window the previous week and hoped it was still available. The little bell above the door gave its familiar tinkling greeting as she stepped inside. The shop was dimly lit, as always, with sunlight filtering through Nottingham lace curtains and glinting on polished wood and silver. The air held the comforting, dusty smell of old furniture, beeswax, and lavender polish. At first glance, everything seemed in order. A grandfather clock ticked solemnly in one corner. A display of Bristol glass sparkled on a side table, and a handsome walnut bureau stood open to reveal its neat pigeonholes. Yet something felt wrong. There was no cheerful "Good morning, Miss Marple" from behind the counter. No sound of Reginald Hargrove's heavy tread in the back room. The counter itself was unusually untidy. Papers lay scattered, a ledger stood open, and one drawer had been pulled out and left hanging. In the high-backed chair behind the desk sat Mr. Hargrove, or what had once been Mr. Hargrove. Miss Marple approached quietly. He was slumped forward, his head resting on his arms amid the papers as though he had fallen asleep while working. A small sherry glass lay on its side nearby, a dark stain spreading across an invoice. His face was turned away, but his hand, visible on the blotter, was unnaturally still. "Mr. Hargrove," she said softly, "are you quite all right?" There was no answer. She reached out and touched the outstretched hand. It was cold, quite cold. Miss Marple did not cry out or faint. She had seen death before in the war and in quieter village tragedies, and she possessed a calm that came from long experience of human frailty. She straightened, looked about the room once more with those deceptively mild blue eyes, and then stepped outside onto the pavement, By fortunate chance, Constable Polk was cycling slowly past on his morning round. He was a young man, earnest and a little self-important, and he touched his helmet respectfully when he saw her. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Constable," she replied in her gentle voice. "I am afraid there is something rather serious at Mr. Hargrove's shop. I believe he may be dead." Constable Polk dismounted at once, propped his bicycle against the wall, and followed her inside. One glance at the figure behind the counter was enough. His face paled. "I'd better telephone Dr. Haydock straight away, miss," he said, and hurried to the instrument in the back room. Within half an hour, the village knew. Dr. Haydock arrived, examined the body, and emerged looking grave. By then, a small knot of villagers had gathered discreetly across the street, murmuring among themselves. Mrs. Price Ridley from the post office was there, and the vicar's wife and several others who had been on their way to the shops. Dr. Haydock spoke quietly to Constable Polk, then crossed to Miss Marple, who waited patiently on a chair near the door. "It's not natural causes, I'm sorry to say," he told her in a low voice. "There are signs of cyanide poisoning. The sherry glass. He must have drunk it quite recently. The police will have to be informed." Miss Marple nodded. "I thought as much," she said simply. News traveled swiftly. By lunchtime, Inspector Slack had arrived from Much Benham in his black car, bristling with official importance. He interviewed Miss Marple briefly, taking notes in a little black book while she answered with quiet precision. "Yes, Inspector, the drawer was open when I came in. The glass was overturned. I touched nothing except Mr. Hargrove's hand to see if he was still alive." The inspector grunted and moved on to examine the scene. The body was removed, the shop sealed, and by evening the village was alive with speculation. At first, the police inclined toward suicide. Reginald Hargrove had been in financial difficulties, debts to wholesalers, overdue rates. More troubling, only a fortnight earlier, a distinguished expert from a London auction house had examined a chair Hargrove had proudly described as a fine example of Chippendale's work. The expert had pronounced it a modern reproduction, cleverly aged but undoubtedly fake. Whispers had begun. Had Hargrove knowingly sold forgeries as genuine antiques? Had shame driven him to take his own life? Yet certain details troubled Miss Marple as she sat that evening in her neat sitting room, knitting a warm scarf in soft gray wool. Suicide was possible, of course. People did desperate things when reputation and livelihood were threatened. But why ransack the shop beforehand? Why scatter papers and leave drawers open? And why spill the fatal glass so carelessly? A man intending to end his life would surely tidy his affairs, not create disorder. She thought of the sherry. Hargrove had a habit of sipping a small glass in the late morning while cataloguing new stock. A harmless indulgence he had mentioned to her more than once. Anyone who knew the shop's routine would know that. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. In a village like St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone else's habits, poison was a peculiarly intimate weapon. It required familiarity, opportunity, and a cool nerve. Outside, the autumn dusk deepened. The church clock struck 6, and somewhere in the quiet lanes and cottages, someone, Miss Marple felt certain, was nursing a very dangerous secret indeed. Chapter 2. The suspects emerge. The inquest was held 2 days later in the parish hall, a plain room with varnished walls and rows of wooden chairs that creaked under the weight of almost the entire village. A low autumn sun slanted through the high windows, catching motes of dust and illuminating faces Miss Marple knew as well as her own. She sat near the back in her usual gray knitted suit, a ball of pale pink wool in her lap and her needles moving with quiet regularity. From this vantage point she could observe everyone without appearing to stare. The coroner, A solemn gentleman from Much Benham guided the proceedings with courteous efficiency. Dr. Haydock gave his evidence clearly. Death by cyanide poisoning, administered orally in a small quantity of sherry. Time of death between 9 and 11 o'clock on the morning Miss Marple had discovered the body. No one challenged the finding of unlawful killing, though the word murder was carefully avoided in favor of the more neutral poisoning by person or persons unknown. The jury returned the expected verdict, and the police were left to pursue their inquiries. Inspector Slack, a square, energetic man with a toothbrush mustache and a habit of barking questions, had already taken up temporary residence at the Blue Boar. He was known in St. Mary Mead from previous cases, and his brusque manner had not endeared him to the villagers. "Facts, not gossip," he was heard to mutter more than once. Yet gossip, as Miss Marple well knew, was often the raw material from which facts were eventually distilled. After the inquest, the crowd lingered in small groups on the gravel outside the hall, reluctant to disperse. Miss Marple paused on the step, exchanging polite greetings. "Terrible business," said Mrs. Price Ridley, clutching her shopping basket. "Poor Mr. Hargrove, who would have thought it?" "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "One never really knows, does one?" Mrs. Bantry, her old friend from Gossington Hall, drew her aside. "Dolly, you found him. Are you quite all right? Come back with me for luncheon. Colonel Bantry is in London, and I should like company." Miss Marple accepted with pleasure. Over cold chicken and salad in the Gossington dining room, the conversation naturally turned to the tragedy. "I always thought Hargrove perfectly respectable," Mrs. Bantry declared, passing the mustard. "A little loud, perhaps, but honest." Miss Marple buttered a piece of bread thoughtfully. "Honesty in antiques is a delicate matter, my dear. Provenance can be elastic, and lately there have been whispers." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "About that Chippendale chair?" "Yes, I heard. Lydia Forrester is furious. She bought a Regency dining table from him only last month, paid a fortune, and now the man from Christie's says the legs are wrong. Wrong grain, wrong dovetails, wrong everything." Miss Marple nodded. Miss Lydia Forrester was a tall, angular spinster of independent means who lived in a red brick house on the outskirts of the village and filled it with beautiful things. She had a sharp tongue and a genuine knowledge of furniture. To be deceived would wound her pride as much as her pocket. "And then there is young Timothy Black," Mrs. Bantry continued, lowering her voice. "Hargrove's assistant. Such a handsome boy, but I'm told they quarreled dreadfully last week. Something about wages, or perhaps something more." Timothy Black was 25, dark-haired, with an easy smile and clever hands. He had worked for Hargrove for 5 years, learning restoration and repair. Villagers liked him. He was always willing to mend a broken chair or reglue a picture frame for a modest fee. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Mrs. Hargrove must be prostrated," she remarked. "Evelyn Hargrove?" Oddly calm, I thought, at the inquest. Sat there in black, very composed. Of course, they say the marriage had grown cool. She has her own friends in London, bridge parties, theaters. Hardly ever. Helped in the shop. Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove was a thin, elegant woman in her early 50s with carefully waved fair hair and a taste for smart clothes. She and Reginald had no children, and village opinion held that she found village life rather dull. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked slowly home along the lane, pausing now and then to admire a late rose or exchange a word with a gardener. Her mind, however, was busy cataloguing the people who might have wished Reginald Hargrove harm. There was also Captain Roger Blaine, a retired Indian Army officer who had moved to St. Mary Mead the previous spring. A tall, soldierly figure with a clipped mustache, he had sold several family pieces to Hargrove to supplement his pension. Heirlooms from an old house in Gloucestershire. Rumor suggested the prices had been disappointingly low, and lately he had been seen studying antique price guides in the library. And one must not forget Mr. Percival Dane, the dealer from the neighboring town of Lonsbury. A thin, pale man with gold-rimmed spectacles, he had long resented Hargrove's success and was known to speak slightingly of his stock. Competition in the antique trade could be fierce. 5 people then, each with a possible grievance. The deceived customer, the underpaid assistant, the distant wife who would inherit, the disappointed seller, the jealous rival. Motives as old as human nature itself. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting. The police might call it suicide, but she could not reconcile the disordered shop with a planned departure from life. Someone had entered after Hargrove drank the poison, someone who searched hurriedly for papers, perhaps a ledger, perhaps letters, before fleeing. She recalled the faint, almost imperceptible trace of scent in the air when she had first entered, a fashionable perfume, not the lavender polish Hargrove favored. And the sherry glass had been placed where a right-handed person would set it down, yet the spill ran in an odd direction. Small things, everyday things. But in St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple had observed many times before, murder was rarely dramatic. It crept in through the ordinary, wearing the face of habit and routine. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows of her little cottage. Somewhere in the village, she felt sure the poisoner was going about daily tasks, speaking politely to neighbors, perhaps even attending the next meeting of the Women's Institute. Miss Marple's needles clicked on. Human nature, she reflected, was much the same everywhere. One had only to watch and wait. Chapter 3. Village Gossip and Initial Clues. The days following the inquest settled into the familiar pattern of village life, yet an undercurrent of excitement ran through every conversation. St. Mary Mead had not experienced such a stir since the affair of the vicarage fender some years before, and the inhabitants made the most of it. The post office, the butcher's, the little tea shop beside the church, all became informal councils of inquiry. Miss Marple, whose mild appearance and passion for knitting made her seem the least threatening of listeners, found herself in great demand. People confided in her because they felt she would neither judge nor repeat their words indiscreetly. In truth, she listened with the patience of a cat at a mouse hole, storing away each scrap of information for future use. On the morning after the inquest, she walked to the high street to post a letter to her nephew Raymond. The post office was crowded, and Mrs. Price Ridley, a stout woman with a loud voice and strong opinions, was holding forth to an audience of 3. "I always said that Captain Blaine was not quite the thing," she declared, weighing out stamps with emphatic thumps. "Military men think they know everything, but when it comes to antiques, he was forever in Hargrove's shop lately, poking and prying. And now we hear he sold family pieces for a song. Mark my words, he discovered he'd been cheated and took his revenge." The others murmured agreement. Miss Marple bought her stamps quietly and lingered over the birthday cards. Later, in the tea shop, she encountered Miss Hartnell, a brisk spinster in tweeds who did much of the village's good works. "Poor Evelyn Hargrove," Miss Hartnell said, stirring her tea vigorously. "She has taken it remarkably well, but then she was always rather detached. I called yesterday with a basket from the Women's Institute. She was wearing a new black frock, very smart, and said her husband had been under great strain lately. Anonymous letters, she told me, accusing him of sharp practice." "Anonymous letters?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes, typed," she said, "threatening to expose the forgeries unless he stopped. She burned them, of course, but they preyed on his mind." Miss Marple made a sympathetic noise and helped herself to a scone. In the afternoon, she paid a call of condolence at the Hargrove house, a solid Victorian villa standing back from the road behind laurel bushes. Mrs. Hargrove received her in the drawing room, which was furnished with restrained elegance, far more modern in taste than the crowded antiques in the shop. "You are very kind to come, Miss Marple," she said in her cool, precise voice. "It has been a dreadful shock, naturally, but one must bear up." She was pale, but perfectly composed, her fair hair neatly waved, her black dress becoming. Only her hands, constantly twisting a handkerchief, betrayed nervousness. Miss Marple expressed sympathy and then, with the gentle inexorableness of the elderly, steered the conversation. "Your husband worked so hard," she murmured, "and with all the worry over that unfortunate chair." Mrs. Hargrove's lips tightened. Reginald was completely deceived himself. Someone supplied him with reproductions in good faith, and he accepted their provenance. He would never knowingly have sold a fake. "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed, "but the scandal must have been distressing." Distressing? It was wicked. Those letters, cowardly, poisonous things. He showed me one. It said his reputation would be ruined unless he confessed publicly. Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the tea tray. And the shop. Such a pity it was left in disorder, as though someone had searched for something. Mrs. Hargrove gave a little shrug. "The police think Reginald did it himself in a fit of despair. Men are sometimes untidy at such moments." Miss Marple did not argue. Instead, she accepted a second cup of tea and allowed the conversation to drift to lighter topics. On her way home, she met young Timothy Black wheeling his bicycle along the lane. He looked tired and strained, the easy smile gone from his face. "Good afternoon, Timothy," she said kindly. "This must be a sad time for you." He stopped, leaning on the handlebars. "It is, Miss Marple. I can't believe he's gone. And the police asking questions. Inspector Slack thinks I know more than I'm telling." "About the quarrel you had?" His cheeks flushed. "Everyone seems to know about that. It was nothing, only about my wages. Mr. Hargrove promised me a rise last spring, but money was tight. Then that London expert came and everything went wrong." "Did you help with restorations?" Miss Marple asked innocently. Timothy hesitated. "A bit, cleaning, polishing, minor repairs. I'm handy with wood." Miss Marple glanced at his hands. Strong, capable hands marked with recent scratches and a trace of sawdust in the cuffs of his jacket. "I noticed some fresh sawdust in the back room when I found poor Mr. Hargrove," she said mildly. "Were you working on something that morning?" "I'd been planning down an old frame the day before," he answered quickly. "It gets everywhere." They parted amiably, but Miss Marple walked on with a thoughtful expression. That evening she sat in her small, comfortable sitting room, the firelight flickering on her white hair as she knitted. Piece by piece the picture was forming. There was the cyanide, kept in the shop for cleaning silver in a bottle any regular visitor might have noticed. There was the sherry, a known habit. There were anonymous letters, perhaps genuine, perhaps not. There was the ransacked drawer suggesting a search for incriminating papers. And there was the faint, lingering trace of expensive perfume she had noticed near the desk. Certainly not Hargrove's lavender polish, nor Timothy's carbolic soap. 5 suspects, each with access and possible motive. Lydia Forrester, swindled and angry. Captain Blaine, perhaps feeling cheated. Timothy Black, quarrelsome and skilled in deception of wood. Mrs. Hargrove, cool and inheriting everything. And somewhere in the background, the shadowy figure of Percival Dane, who might have supplied false pieces or simply wished his rival ill. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and gazed into the fire. In her long life she had observed that greed and fear wore many disguises, but they always left traces in the everyday details others overlooked. A speck of sawdust, a drift of perfume, a typed letter too conveniently burned. Outside, the village slept peacefully under the stars. But Miss Marple knew that somewhere behind those curtained windows, someone was lying awake, wondering how much was guessed, how soon the net would close. Her needles took up their quiet rhythm again. There was no hurry. In St. Mary Mead, truth had a way of emerging gently like crocuses through spring soil. One had only to watch and wait. Chapter 4. False Leads in the Countryside. Inspector Slack lost no time in pursuing what he considered the most promising lines of inquiry. By the middle of the week following the inquest, he had interviewed Miss Lydia Forrester twice, once at her home and once at the police station in Much Benham. Her motive, in his view, was plain. She had been swindled out of a considerable sum for a table now declared spurious, and her indignation had been public knowledge. "Threatened to take legal action, didn't you, Miss Forrester?" he demanded, fixing her with a stern eye. Lydia Forrester, tall and unbending in a severe navy costume, met his gaze without flinching. "I certainly considered it, Inspector. Any reasonable person would. But I did not poison the man. On the morning in question, I was playing bridge at Mrs. Dane Price's from 10 o'clock until luncheon. 6 witnesses can confirm it." Inspector Slack grunted, clearly disappointed, and turned his attention to Captain Blaine. The captain lived in a small, impeccably kept cottage near the cricket ground. His sitting room was decorated with regimental photographs and a few good watercolors. The furniture was simple but well polished. He received the inspector with military courtesy, offering a glass of sherry which Slack refused. "I sold Hargrove 3 pieces last summer," Blaine admitted readily. "A walnut bureau, a set of 6 dining chairs, and a small occasional table. Family things, had to let them go. He offered what seemed fair prices at the time, but lately I've wondered if I was diddled. Still, that's a long way from murder." "And where were you on the morning of the death?" "Walking. I take the same route every day, down to the river, across the meadow and back by the church. I passed the postman at 9:30 and old Mr. Clements at the stile around 10. They'll both remember." The alibis were solid. Slack returned to the Blue Boar in an irritable mood and confided to the landlord that villagers were too ready with their alibis. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her quiet perambulations. She believed in the value of fresh air and gentle exercise for clear thinking, and the lanes around St. Mary Mead offered ample opportunity for both. One afternoon she took the footpath that skirted the back of Hargrove's shop, noting that the yard gate stood ajar. On impulse, she stepped inside. The yard was small, cluttered with packing cases and odd bits of broken furniture awaiting repair. A lean-to shed served as Timothy Black's workshop. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of glue, varnish, and freshly sawn wood. On the bench lay a half-finished picture frame and several tools neatly arranged. Miss Marple's eye was caught by a small pot of modern adhesive. Clear, quick-drying, quite different from the traditional animal glue used in genuine antique repairs. Beside it stood a tin of wood stain and a bundle of fine sandpaper. Nothing incriminating in itself, yet she filed the observation away. As she emerged, she encountered Timothy himself carrying a parcel from the gate. "Miss Marple, didn't expect to see you here." "I was admiring the Michaelmas daisies along the path," she explained mildly. "Such a pretty show this year. You work very hard, Timothy." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "Have to keep things tidy for the auction. Mrs. Hargrove wants the stock cleared." "An auction? So soon?" "Next week. Everything must go," she says. "Debts to settle." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically and continued her walk. An auction would bring interested parties from far and wide, including, no doubt, Mr. Percival Dane. That same evening, a fresh piece of evidence came to light. Constable Polk, cycling past the shop after dark, noticed a flicker of light inside. Investigating, he discovered a side window forced and signs of a hurried search, drawers pulled out again, papers strewn. Nothing appeared to have been taken, but a torn scrap of paper was found on the floor. An anonymous note, typed like the others Mrs. Hargrove had mentioned, accusing Timothy Black of stealing small items from the shop over several months. The note was delivered to Inspector Slack, who immediately summoned Timothy for further questioning. The young man denied the accusations hotly. "Someone's trying to make trouble for me," he protested. "I've never taken a thing that wasn't mine." Slack was inclined to believe the note genuine, a disgruntled accomplice perhaps, or a customer settling a grudge. He redoubled his surveillance of the assistant. Miss Marple heard of the new development from Mrs. Bantry over tea the following day. "It's all most confusing," Mrs. Bantry said, passing the cucumber sandwiches. "First they thought it was suicide, then Lydia Forrester, then poor Captain Blaine, and now Timothy. And that break-in, clearly someone is looking for something. Or wishing to create confusion," Miss Marple suggested gently. "A second search, so soon after the first, and leaving an accusing note behind. It has the air of misdirection." Mrs. Bantry stared. "You mean the murderer returned? Or someone who wishes us to think so? In my experience, my dear, when evidence appears too conveniently, it often repays closer examination." She thought again of the faint perfume she had noticed on the day of the discovery. Not Lydia Forrester's sharp lavender water, nor Timothy's lack of any scent at all, but something softer, more expensive. And the typed notes. Anyone with access to a typewriter could produce them. Mrs. Hargrove, for instance, typed her husband's business letters when the mood took her. Walking home through the twilight, Miss Marple paused at the lich gate to watch the rooks settling in the elms around the churchyard. False leads were multiplying like weeds in an untended garden. Lydia's anger, Blaine's disappointment, Timothy's supposed thefts, even the suggestion of a second intruder. Yet somewhere among them or behind them lay the truth. She recalled a case years ago in which a forged will had been supported by a series of cleverly planted minor forgeries, all designed to distract from the real document hidden in plain sight. Human beings, she reflected, were fond of elaborate smokescreens when a simple one would serve. The wind carried the distant sound of the church clock striking 6. Miss Marple turned towards her cottage, her mind busy. The auction would bring matters to a head. People under pressure often betrayed themselves when money and reputation were at stake. There was no need to hurry. In St. Mary Mead, as in life, patterns revealed themselves to those who waited patiently and observed the small, apparently insignificant details that others overlooked. Chapter 5. The Auction and Hidden Secrets. The auction of Hargrove's remaining stock was fixed for a Saturday morning in the village hall, and by 9 o'clock the place was crowded. Long tables had been set up along the walls, laden with silver, porcelain, pictures, and furniture, all carefully numbered with little white labels. Villagers mingled with dealers from farther afield, catalogues in hand, while the auctioneer, Mr. Fletcher from Much Benham, arranged his gavel and papers on a raised dais at one end. Miss Marple arrived early and secured a seat near the front, her knitting bag on her lap. From here she could watch both the lots and the bidders. Mrs. Hargrove sat in the front row, dressed in deep mourning, her face pale but composed. Timothy Black moved quietly among the tables, answering questions and pointing out details to prospective buyers. Captain Blaine stood near a group of dining chairs, examining them with a thoughtful frown. Lydia Forrester was absent. She had declared she would never set foot in anything connected with Hargrove again. But Percival Dane was very much present, thin and alert in a dark suit, his gold spectacles glinting as he scrutinized each piece. The sale began with small items: a set of Sheffield plate candlesticks, a Worcester jug, a collection of ivory miniatures. Bidding was brisk but unremarkable. Then came the furniture: A mahogany bureau brought a respectable price, and a pretty, little rosewood work table went to a stranger from London. Miss Marple's attention sharpened when lot 47 was carried forward. The notorious Chippendale chair, the one whose exposure had started the trouble. The auctioneer described it cautiously as in the style of Chippendale, and bidding was slow. In the end, it was knocked down to Percival Dane for a modest sum. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Later, during a pause while lots were rearranged, Miss Marple slipped into the small side room where unsold items were stored. A large walnut bookcase stood against the wall, its doors ajar. On impulse, she opened one wider and peered inside. Tucked behind a row of leather-bound volumes was a slim ledger, its cover worn but the pages recent. She drew it out and flicked through it quickly. The entries were in two different hands. One, bold and flowing, she recognized as Reginald Hargrove's. The other was smaller, neater. Timothy Black's, she felt sure. Purchases were listed on the left, modest sums for job lots and estate pieces. On the right, sales at considerably higher prices described as fine Georgian or rare Regency. The difference was striking. Here, plainly recorded, was evidence of systematic deception. She was about to close the book when a shadow fell across the page. Timothy Black stood in the doorway, his face startled. "Miss Marple, I didn't know anyone was in here." "I was looking for a chair to rest my feet," she said mildly, slipping the ledger back into place. "These old legs, you know." He relaxed slightly. "Of course. Let me fetch one for you." As he turned away, Miss Marple noticed a faint smear of wood stain on his cuff, fresh, still tacky. Back in the hall, the bidding resumed. A handsome Regency sofa went for a good price, and then lot 63. A small silver christening mug prettily engraved. Mrs. Hargrove suddenly rose, pressed a hand to her forehead, and swayed. Timothy hurried to her side, and with the help of a neighbor, she was led outside for air. The incident caused a ripple of concern. "Poor woman," murmured Mrs. Bantry, who had arrived late and was sitting beside Miss Marple. "The strain must be dreadful." Miss Marple watched thoughtfully. Mrs. Hargrove had seemed perfectly steady until that moment. And the mug, had it some special significance? After the sale ended, the crowd dispersed slowly, discussing bargains and disappointments. Percival Dane loaded several lots into a van, looking pleased. Captain Blaine bought nothing. Timothy helped carry furniture to waiting vehicles, his expression strained. Miss Marple lingered until most people had gone, then returned to the side room. The ledger was no longer behind the books. Someone had removed it during the confusion of Mrs. Hargrove's faint. That evening she sat by her fire knitting a border of lace for a baby's shawl. The auction had revealed much. Percival Dane's eager bidding suggested he wished to acquire and perhaps quietly dispose of pieces that might betray their origins. Timothy's nervousness and the stained cuff hinted at recent work, perhaps completing a final restoration. Mrs. Hargrove's sudden indisposition had provided the perfect diversion for someone to retrieve the ledger. And yet the pieces did not quite fit. If Timothy and Hargrove had been partners in fraud, why murder the man who provided the shop and the customers? Greed, perhaps, if Hargrove had threatened to end the arrangement or confess, or fear, if the exposure of the chair had made him likely to talk. Miss Marple thought of the faint perfume again and the lipstick she had noticed very faintly on the rim of the overturned sherry glass. A pale rose shade, fashionable in London salons. Not Lydia Forrester's bold crimson nor any color a young man would use. Mrs. Hargrove favored exactly that shade. She laid down her knitting. Two people then with opportunity and skill, Timothy to prepare the poison, he handled the cleaning fluids daily, and Mrs. Hargrove to administer it, knowing her husband's habit of the morning sherry. Together they might have planned to inherit the business, clear the stock, and begin again without the threat of exposure hanging over them. But proof was another matter. The ledger had vanished, the anonymous notes were burned, the perfume was a memory, and Inspector Slack, she suspected, was still pursuing the convenient theory of an angry customer or jealous rival. Outside, a light rain began to fall, pattering on the leaves. Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains. There was time yet. In villages, secrets had a way of betraying themselves through small inconsistencies. The wrong shade of lipstick, a ledger too hastily hidden, a feint too conveniently timed. She returned to her chair and picked up her needles. Patience, she reminded herself, was the detective's greatest virtue. The pattern was almost complete. Only a few more strands needed to be drawn together. Chapter 6. Twists in the Tea Room. The village tea room, a small establishment with lace curtains and a hissing urn behind the counter, had rarely been so full. On the Monday afternoon following the auction, almost every table was occupied. The air hummed with conversation, and the waitresses, two flustered girls from the council school, darted about with trays of tea and toasted tea cakes. Miss Marple sat at her favorite corner table near the window, a pot of Darjeeling in front of her and a plate containing one modest scone. From this position she could observe the room without appearing to do so. Mrs. Bantry joined her presently, full of news. "My dear Dolly," she began, settling her ample form into the chair, "you will never guess what I heard this morning. Captain Blaine has been telling everyone that some of his family pieces, the ones he sold to Hargrove, were not quite what he believed them to be." Miss Marple poured tea carefully. "In what way, my dear?" Apparently an aunt of his years ago had several reproductions made for a secondary house in the country. Good ones, but reproductions all the same. They came down to him and he sold them in perfect good faith. Hargrove paid modest prices, exactly what they were worth, really. But if he passed them off as genuine, well... Mrs. Bantry paused for breath and buttered a tea cake lavishly. "So Captain Blaine has no grievance after all," Miss Marple murmured. "None whatever. He feels rather foolish, but relieved that no one can accuse him of being cheated. And it rather lets him out of the picture, doesn't it?" Miss Marple agreed that it did. At the next table sat Miss Hartnell and Mrs. Price Ridley, their voices carrying clearly. "I always said Timothy Black was too clever by half," Mrs. Price Ridley announced. "Did you see him at the auction? Hovering about like a hawk. And now I hear he's been selling things privately. Little bits of silver and porcelain to people in Lonsbury." Miss Hartnell nodded vigorously. "Mrs. Archer told me she bought a pretty little cream jug from him last week. Said it came from the shop clearance. But Mrs. Hargrove says no such thing was authorized." The conversation drifted to the break-in and the anonymous note accusing Timothy of theft. Opinion was divided. Some thought the note genuine, others a malicious invention. Miss Marple listened quietly. Private sales could mean many things. An honest attempt to earn a little extra or something more sinister. Presently the door opened to admit Percival Dane, who hesitated on the threshold before choosing a table near the back. He ordered coffee and opened a catalogue, but his eyes strayed frequently to the other occupants. When Mrs. Bantry noticed him, she waved cheerfully. "Mr. Dane, you got some bargains on Saturday, I hear." He smiled thinly. "A few pieces that will clean up nicely. Hargrove had an eye for quality, whatever else one might say." Mrs. Bantry, never subtle, plunged on. "Did you ever supply him with stock yourself?" Dane's expression stiffened. "Certainly not. We were competitors, Mrs. Bantry, not collaborators." He returned to his catalogue, and the subject was dropped. Miss Marple finished her scone and brushed crumbs from her lap. The tea-room gossip was useful, but it also muddied the waters. Timothy's private sales could suggest he was disposing of incriminating items or simply trying to make ends meet. Percival Dane's defensiveness might indicate jealousy or something more, and Captain Blaine's innocent mistake removed one motive while leaving others untouched. As she prepared to leave, Lydia Forrester entered unexpectedly. She had avoided village gatherings since the scandal, but today she marched straight to Miss Marple's table. "Miss Marple, may I join you a moment? I have something to say." Mrs. Bantry, sensing drama, made her excuses and departed. Lydia sat down, her angular face flushed. "I have been to London," she announced. "I took my table to the expert who originally examined Hargrove's chair. He confirmed it is a modern fake, cleverly done with forged marks and artificial aging. The dovetails are machine-cut, the wood stained to look old. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "And you feel the police should know?" "I have already told Inspector Slack. But there is more. The expert believes the same hand produced both the chair and my table. He noticed identical tool marks, tiny scratches from a particular plane blade, a signature almost." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "That is most interesting, Miss Forrester. Most interesting indeed." Lydia leaned forward. "I am not vindictive, Miss Marple, but I was cheated of £800. I want the person responsible brought to justice, whether it was Hargrove himself or someone working with him." She rose abruptly and left, leaving a ripple of speculation in her wake. Outside, the afternoon had turned chilly. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind turning over the new information. Identical tool marks pointed directly to the craftsman, Timothy Black, with his workshop and his skill. Yet the fraud had been profitable for Hargrove too. Why kill the golden goose unless the goose threatened to confess? And there was still the question of who had tipped off the London expert in the first place. Someone who knew the pieces were false and wished to see Hargrove exposed. Percival Dane, Lydia herself, or Mrs. Hargrove perhaps laying the groundwork for her husband's suicide. In her cottage that evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire with a new ball of wool, soft blue for a baby's bonnet. The picture was clearer now, a partnership in deception threatened by exposure, resolved by murder disguised as suicide. The ransacking, the missing ledger, the conveniently timed feint at the auction, all pointed to two people acting together. But one piece still puzzled her, the faint trace of lipstick on the sherry glass. Timothy would not wear lipstick. Yet if Mrs. Hargrove had poured the fatal drink during a morning visit, perhaps bringing papers for signature, she might easily have left such a mark. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Almost all the threads were in place. One more small confirmation, perhaps, and the pattern would be complete. Outside, the wind moaned in the chimney. In St. Mary Mead, winter was drawing near, but the chill in one human heart had already proved deadly. Chapter 7. Narrowing the Circle. By the end of that week, the police investigation appeared to have settled firmly upon Timothy Black. Inspector Slack had discovered that the young man had recently opened a post office savings account with a deposit considerably larger than his wages could explain. Combined with the anonymous note found after the break-in, the private sales, and the identical tool marks on the forged pieces, it seemed to the inspector an open and shut case. Timothy was questioned again, this time for several hours at Much Benham police station. He emerged pale and shaken, though still protesting his innocence. "It's savings from odd jobs," he insisted to anyone who would listen. "Restoring furniture for people in their homes. Nothing to do with the shop." Village opinion was divided. Some felt sorry for the young man. Others nodded wisely and said they had always thought him too smooth-tongued. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. She had spent a quiet morning in her garden, tying up the last chrysanthemums against the frost, and her thoughts had arranged themselves with satisfying clarity. In the afternoon, she paid a call on Mrs. Hargrove. The widow received her in the morning room, a pleasant apartment overlooking the laurels. A small fire burned in the grate, and the tea tray was already laid. "You are very kind, Miss Marple," Mrs. Hargrove said, pouring tea with steady hands. "Most people avoid the house now as though tragedy were contagious." Miss Marple accepted her cup. "One understands, but you have borne it bravely." Mrs. Hargrove sighed. "One must. There are practical matters, bills, the remaining stock, the accounts. Reginald was not always methodical, I fear. They spoke of ordinary things for a while, the coming bazaar, the new curate's sermon." Then Miss Marple set down her cup. "I have been wondering about the cyanide," she said gently. "Such a dangerous substance to keep in a shop." Mrs. Hargrove's fingers tightened momentarily on her handkerchief. "It was for cleaning silver. Timothy bought a fresh bottle only last month. The police have it now." "Indeed. And the sherry, your husband's little habit. Did you ever join him in a glass when you visited the shop?" "Sometimes, on quiet mornings." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's eyes were mild. "Only because I noticed a very faint trace of lipstick on the rim of the overturned glass. Such a pretty rose shade, the one you are wearing today, I think." Mrs. Hargrove touched her lips unconsciously. "Many women use this color. It is quite popular." "True, but it set me thinking. A visitor who knew his routine, who poured the sherry perhaps as a kindly gesture, might have left such a mark without realizing." Mrs. Hargrove set her cup down with a small clink. "You are suggesting I poisoned my own husband?" "I am suggesting nothing, my dear, merely observing." There was a short silence. Then Mrs. Hargrove rose. "I think I am rather tired, Miss Marple. Thank you for calling." Miss Marple took her leave without protest. Later that day she encountered Percival Dane in the High Street. He was carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper, and he greeted her with his usual thin politeness. "A sad business, Miss Marple, but it seems the police are close to an arrest. Young Timothy?" "Yes, it appears so, though I wonder if the net is cast quite wide enough." Dane's pale eyes flickered behind his spectacles. "Meaning?" "Only that rivalry can take many forms. Supplying a competitor with inferior stock, perhaps, and then arranging for its exposure. A reputation ruined is a shop gained, after all." He flushed slightly. "I resent the implication. I bought pieces at the auction in good faith, nothing more." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured and passed on. That evening she paid a brief visit to the vicarage, where the vicar's wife pressed her to stay for supper. Over seed cake and cocoa the conversation turned, as it always did, to the tragedy. "I feel so sorry for Timothy," the vicar's wife said. "He has no family here, you know, and Mrs. Hargrove seems almost too composed." Miss Marple nodded. "Composure can be a shield, my dear, or a habit acquired over years." She left early, pleading the cold, and walked home through the dark lanes. The circle was narrowing indeed. Lydia Forrester's anger was genuine but harmless. Captain Blaine's motive had dissolved into embarrassment. Percival Dane's rivalry was real, but he had no access to the cyanide or the sherry glass. That left Timothy and Mrs. Hargrove working together, she was now certain. Timothy to craft the forgeries, Mrs. Hargrove to share the profits, and when exposure threatened, to silence her husband forever. The ransacking to find and destroy the ledger, the feint to create diversion. The anonymous notes perhaps typed by her own hand to direct suspicion elsewhere. But one small point still needed confirmation. The next morning Miss Marple went again to the shop, now closed and silent. Constable Polk, on duty nearby, let her in at her request. I left my umbrella after the auction, she explained plausibly. Inside, the place felt desolate, stripped of its treasures. She moved slowly to the back room where the cleaning materials were kept. The shelf was bare. The police had taken everything, but on the floor in a dusty corner lay a small cork stopper, the kind used on a narrow bottle. She picked it up delicately and slipped it into her handbag. Later at home, she compared it with a stopper from her own household ammonia bottle. They matched exactly. And on the cork was a faint, unmistakable trace of that same rose lipstick, transferred perhaps when a hurried hand had pressed it back after use. Miss Marple sat back with a small sigh of satisfaction. The pattern was complete. Timothy had prepared the poison. Mrs. Hargrove had administered it during a morning visit, perhaps under pretext of bringing papers or discussing household bills. The lipstick mark, the perfume, the dual handwriting in the vanished ledger, all pointed to a cool, calculated partnership. Tomorrow, she decided, she would speak to Inspector Slack. But first, one final gathering. Quiet, civilized, over tea in her own sitting room. People so often revealed themselves when confronted gently in familiar surroundings. She picked up her knitting and began a new row. The end was in sight, and justice, though delayed, would be served with the minimum of fuss, exactly as things were done in St. Mary, Mead. Chapter 8. The telling observation. The following morning brought a hard frost, silvering the lawns and rooftops of St. Mary, Mead, and turning the breath of early walkers into small white clouds. Miss Marple, wrapped in a warm woolen coat and a soft scarf she had knitted herself, set out with a small basket over her arm. She had letters to post and a few errands, but her real purpose was observation. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Price Ridley was in full flow. "Another anonymous letter," she announced triumphantly to the little queue. "Posted yesterday, addressed to Inspector Slack himself, accusing poor Timothy of everything short of highway robbery. Typed, of course, the cowardice of it." Miss Marple bought her stamps and listened quietly. A second forged note, arriving just as suspicion focused on Timothy, had all the hallmarks of desperation. Someone was trying too hard to direct attention away from themselves. From the post office, she walked to the police station, a small brick building beside the village hall, where Constable Polk was sweeping the step. "Good morning, Constable," she said pleasantly. "I wonder if I might have a word with Inspector Slack." Polk looked doubtful. "He's very busy, miss. The case is nearly closed, he says. Nevertheless, I have a small piece of information that may interest him." She was shown into the tiny office where Inspector Slack sat behind a desk piled with papers. He greeted her without enthusiasm. "Well, Miss Marple, I hope this won't take long. We're expecting to make an arrest today." Miss Marple sat down and opened her handbag. She produced the small cork stopper she had found in the shop, holding it carefully in a clean handkerchief. "This was on the floor of the back room, Inspector. It fits the cyanide bottle, I believe. And you will notice a faint mark on one side. Lipstick, the same rose shade worn by Mrs. Hargrove." Slack took it gingerly and examined it under his desk lamp. Could be, but it might have got there any time." "Possibly," Miss Marple agreed. "But combined with the trace on the sherry glass, it suggests a woman handled the bottle shortly before the poison was used." Slack grunted. "We've got enough on the young man. Bank deposit, tool marks, motive." "Indeed. But consider, Inspector, if Timothy acted alone, why the ransacking? Why remove the ledger that recorded his own profits? And why these increasingly desperate anonymous notes pointing at him?" Slack shifted uncomfortably. "Trying to make it look like someone else, perhaps. Or someone else trying to make it look like him," Miss Marple suggested, mildly. She left him frowning over the stopper and continued her walk. At the corner, she met Timothy Black, looking pale and defiant. "They've told me not to leave the village," he said bitterly, "as if I'd run away." Miss Marple stopped. "Timothy, may I ask you something quite personal?" He hesitated, then nodded. "That savings account. Where did the money truly come from?" He glanced around, then spoke in a low voice. "From selling the fakes, yes, but it wasn't just me. Mr. Hargrove planned it all. He bought cheap modern pieces and I aged them. Stains, wormholes, the right kind of wear. He said we'd split the extra profit, 50-50. Then when the London man spotted the chair, he panicked. Said he'd confess everything and close the shop. Mrs. Hargrove came to me the next day. She was furious. Said if he talked, we'd all be ruined. She told me to prepare something strong just to make him ill, to keep him quiet for a while." His voice faltered. "But you didn't use it?" "No, I couldn't. I threw it away. I swear I never touched him." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Timothy. That is all I needed to know." She walked on, her mind now perfectly clear. Timothy had been drawn into the fraud, but drew the line at murder. The cool mind behind the actual poisoning belonged to the woman who stood to lose most if the business collapsed. Evelyn Hargrove. She had taken the poison Timothy prepared, used it herself during a morning visit, and then built an elaborate structure of misdirection, ransacking forged notes, even the timed feint at the auction, to throw suspicion onto her accomplice. One final detail remained. Miss Marple called at the vicarage again, where the vicar's wife was arranging flowers for Sunday. "My dear," Miss Marple said, "you mentioned once that Mrs. Hargrove types her husband's business letters when she feels inclined. Does she have her own machine?" "Yes, a little portable. She brought it to the typing pool during the war, very efficient." "And the keys, are they perfectly clean?" The vicar's wife looked puzzled. "Now you mention it, the E and the A were rather worn. She said it needed a new ribbon." Miss Marple thanked her and returned home. A typewriter with worn keys would match the anonymous notes exactly. That evening she wrote brief notes to 5 people: Mrs. Hargrove, Timothy Black, Captain Blaine, Lydia Forrester, and Percival Dane, inviting them to tea at her cottage the following afternoon. A similar note went to Inspector Slack, phrased as a courteous request for his presence at a small gathering. She added a postscript to Mrs. Hargrove. "I have found something that belonged to your husband, a small item from the shop. I think you should have it." Then she sat by the fire and finished the blue baby's bonnet, her needles moving with calm precision. Tomorrow would bring the end of the matter. In St. Mary, Mead, such things were best settled quietly, over tea and in the presence of one's neighbors. Dramatic scenes were unnecessary when the truth, gently presented, could be more devastating than any accusation. Outside, the frost glittered under a clear moon. Miss Marple drew the curtains, banked the fire, and went to bed with the peaceful mind of one whose pattern, carefully worked, was finally complete. Chapter 9. The revelation in the drawing room. The following afternoon was mild for the season, with weak sunshine filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's small sitting room. A bright fire burned in the grate, and on the low table stood her best spode tea service, a plate of thinly cut bread and butter, another of scones with strawberry jam and clotted cream, and a Victoria sponge she had baked herself that morning. Her guests arrived punctually. Inspector Slack came first, looking important and a little suspicious. Captain Blaine followed, military and correct. Lydia Forrester entered with a stiff nod to the others. Percival Dane hesitated on the threshold before choosing a chair near the door. Timothy Black came next, pale but composed, and finally Mrs. Hargrove, elegantly dressed in black, carrying a small parcel. Miss Marple greeted each with gentle courtesy, pressing them to take a seat and accepting their condolences on the trouble she had taken with her own hands. When all were served with tea and the initial polite conversation about the weather and the church flowers had subsided, Miss Marple set down her cup and spoke in her soft, precise voice. "Thank you all for coming. I have asked you here because this sad affair touches each of you in some way, and I believe it is time the truth was spoken plainly in the presence of everyone concerned." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "If this is about the case, Miss Marple, I must remind you." She raised a delicate hand. "Bear with me a moment, Inspector. I shall be brief." She turned to the company. Mr. Hargrove's death was not suicide nor the act of an angry customer or jealous rival. It was murder, carefully planned to look like suicide in order to conceal a profitable fraud. A small stir went round the room. Lydia Forrester's eyes narrowed. Percival Dane adjusted his spectacles. "The fraud was simple," Miss Marple continued. "Modern reproductions were bought cheaply, skillfully aged and altered, then sold as genuine antiques at high prices. The ledger recording these transactions, written in 2 different hands, was hidden at the auction and later removed. The exposure of one chair threatened everything, and Mr. Hargrove, in a panic, spoke of confession. That could not be allowed." She paused and looked at Timothy Black. "Timothy, you were drawn into the scheme. You have skill with wood, stains, glues, tool marks that matched the fakes. You shared the profits. But when poison was suggested, you refused." Timothy nodded miserably. "I did. Miss, I couldn't do it." Mrs. Hargrove set her cup down with a sharp click. "This is outrageous. Are you accusing—" Miss Marple's gaze rested on her gently. "I am explaining, my dear. You knew your husband's habit of taking a small sherry in the morning. You visited the shop that day. Perhaps with papers to sign, perhaps with some small domestic errand. You poured the sherry yourself, adding the cyanide Timothy had prepared but could not bring himself to use. A kindly gesture, he would think. Then you left, and later the shop was ransacked to find and destroy the ledger." Mrs. Hargrove's face had gone very white. "You have no proof." "Small proofs, but they accumulate," Miss Marple said. "The faint trace of your rose lipstick on the sherry glass, and on the cork stopper of the cyanide bottle, which I found later on the floor. The expensive perfume I noticed when I discovered the body, yours, not Mr. Hargrove's lavender polish. The anonymous notes typed on your own machine with its worn E and A keys designed to throw suspicion onto Timothy. Your timely feint at the auction, giving someone the chance to remove the ledger. And the ransacking, hurried but careful enough to take only what incriminated you both." She reached into her handbag and produced the cork stopper in its clean handkerchief, laying it on the table. Inspector Slack leaned forward, his expression grim. Mrs. Hargrove stared at the stopper as though it were a snake. For a long moment no one spoke, then her composure cracked. "It was his fault," she burst out, voice shaking. "He grew careless. That chair, he should never have sold it to someone who knew. He would have ruined us both, confess everything, close the shop, leave us penniless. I only meant to frighten him at first, make him ill. But the dose was stronger." Timothy buried his face in his hands. Inspector Slack rose. "Evelyn Hargrove, I must caution you." She stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. "No, no more. It's over." She began to weep, not dramatically, but with the exhausted tears of someone whose carefully built defenses had finally crumbled. The others sat in silence. Captain Blaine looked shocked. Lydia Forrester's anger had turned to pity. Percival Dane stared at the carpet. Miss Marple poured fresh tea for Timothy, who had gone very white. "You will be charged as an accessory, I fear," she told him gently. "But your refusal to commit the final act will count in your favor. Speak the truth now, and it will be better for you." He nodded, unable to speak. Inspector Slack took charge with quiet efficiency. Mrs. Hargrove was led away to the waiting car. Timothy followed willingly. The others were thanked and dismissed. When the room was empty save for Miss Marple and the inspector, he scratched his head. "I'd got it all wrong, fixed on the lad." "How did you see it so clearly?" Miss Marple began to clear the tea things. "Human nature, Inspector. Greed and fear wear everyday faces. A trace of lipstick, a whiff of perfume, a cork on the floor. These are the things that betray us when grander schemes fail." Slack grunted, half admiring, half embarrassed. "Well, ma'am, the chief constable will want to thank you." She smiled. "A cup of tea is thanks enough. Now do have another slice of sponge before you go. It really is quite light." He accepted, and for a few minutes they spoke of ordinary matters while the fire settled into glowing embers. Outside, the mild afternoon faded towards dusk. St. Mary Mead would talk for weeks, but the talk would be tempered with relief. Justice had been done, quietly and without scandal, in the best village tradition. Miss Marple washed the cups, put away the uneaten scones for tomorrow's birds, and sat down with her knitting. Another pattern completed, another small corner of human wickedness set straight. Chapter 10. Resolution over morning tea. A fortnight later, on a bright, cold morning with the promise of winter in the air, Miss Marple's sitting room was once again filled with the comfortable aroma of freshly brewed tea. Frost still lingered on the hedgerows outside, but inside the fire crackled cheerfully, and the table was set with her best embroidered cloth, a plate of buttered toast, scones still warm from the oven, and a seed cake that had turned out particularly well. Mrs. Bantry arrived first, rosy from her walk across the fields from Gossington Hall. Miss Hartnell followed, brisk in tweeds and carrying a jar of her homemade blackberry jelly as a small offering. The vicar's wife came next, bearing a bunch of late chrysanthemums from the vicarage greenhouse. Finally, Dr. Haydock looked in, having just finished his morning surgery. They gathered round the fire in a companionable circle, cups in hand, while Miss Marple poured tea with her usual quiet precision. "Well, Dolly," Mrs. Bantry began, unable to contain herself any longer, "you must tell us everything. The newspapers were very discreet, just woman charged and young man assisting police. But we know it was you who saw it all." Miss Marple smiled gently and passed the scones. "There is little to tell that you do not already know, my dears. Mrs. Hargrove has made a full confession. Timothy Black, though deeply implicated in the fraud, took no part in the actual crime and has been treated accordingly. He will probably receive a light sentence and, I hope, make a fresh start elsewhere." Dr. Haydock nodded. The poison was definitely cyanide from the shop bottle. Enough to act swiftly. Poor Hargrove would have known very little. "Poor man indeed," said the vicar's wife softly, "though he brought much of it on himself." Miss Hartnell helped herself to seed cake. "And all for money? One never quite understands greed, does one? They had a comfortable home, a good business, but not quite good enough for Mrs. Hargrove," Miss Marple observed. "She enjoyed the little luxuries, London shops, bridge parties, smart clothes. When the threat of exposure appeared, she acted to protect her way of life. Human nature is very simple, really. We all have our weaknesses." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "But how did you suspect her so particularly, Dolly? There were so many others. Lydia Forrester furious about her table, Captain Blaine thinking he'd been cheated, that oily Mr. Dane hoping to profit from the ruin." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Small things, my dear, as always. The trace of lipstick on the glass and the bottle stopper. The perfume that lingered in the shop. Expensive, not the sort a young man would use. The anonymous notes typed on her own machine. And the ransacking, done by someone who knew exactly what to look for and where it might be hidden. A stranger would have made more disturbance." She set her cup down. Then there was the feint at the auction, so perfectly timed to allow the ledger to be removed. And finally, Timothy's own confession to me that he had prepared the poison but could not bring himself to use it. Someone else took it from him. Who had the opportunity and the coolness? Only Mrs. Hargrove. Dr. Haydock chuckled. Inspector Slack is still a little red about it. He was convinced it was the young man alone. Inspector Slack is thorough, Miss Marple said kindly, but he sometimes sees only the obvious. In villages, one learns to notice the less obvious, the everyday details that betray us all in the end. The conversation drifted to lighter topics. Plans for the Christmas bazaar, the new curates promising sermons, the price of coal. The tragedy was over, justice served, and St. Mary Mead could return to its usual gentle rhythm. When her guests had gone, promising to call again soon, Miss Marple cleared the table and washed the cups with methodical care. Then she settled by the fire with her knitting, a warm scarf and soft heather wool for the district nurse. Outside, the winter sun glinted on the frosted garden. The church clock struck 11, and a robin sang from the apple tree. All was peaceful, orderly, and just as it should be. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Another small drama of human folly and retribution had passed, leaving only the quiet satisfaction of truth restored. In St. Mary Mead, life went on, comforting, familiar, and beneath the surface as full of hidden currents as ever. But for today at least, the village could rest easy, warmed by the knowledge that wrong had been righted gently and without fuss over a cup of morning tea.